Every great power likes to believe it was shaped by triumph, by clear victories and bold declarations. Modern China is no exception. The official story usually begins in 1949 when a new government was proclaimed and a new era announced to the world. But history rarely turns on the moments that are most visible. Sometimes the future of a nation is decided quietly behind closed doors, by a document most people never read and a decision few ever questioned. In August 1945, while the world was celebrating the end of World War II, China's fate was being negotiated thousands of miles away, not in Beijing or Yan'an, but in Moscow. It was not Mao Zedong who held the decisive cards, and it was not Kai-shek who truly controlled the outcome. The future of China rested in the hands of one man who was not Chinese at all. On the surface, what followed looked like a simple diplomatic agreement, a treaty promising friendship, stability, and non-interference. On paper, it appeared to guarantee peace and even cooperation. But beneath the signatures and formal language, something far more dangerous was unfolding. A silent double game was already in motion, one that would decide the outcome of China's civil war before it officially resumed, and shape how China would view power, trust, and international promises for generations. To understand why modern China thinks the way it does today, why it treats agreements with caution and prioritizes strength above words, we have to return to that forgotten moment in 1945 and to the treaty that did not just end a war, but quietly created a new world order. Modern China is often explained through revolution, ideology, and victory. But the truth is far less dramatic and far more unsettling. The country the world deals with today was not created by a single speech, a final battle, or a moment of national triumph. It was shaped quietly, almost invisibly, by a decision made far from China's borders. In August 1945, while the world celebrated the end of World War II, China was bleeding, exhausted, and vulnerable. And at that precise moment, its future slipped into the hands of someone who was neither Chinese nor accountable to the Chinese people. What followed was not a war, but a signature, not a betrayal announced to the world, but one carried out in silence. On paper, it looked like peace. In reality, it was a calculated double move that decided China's civil war before it truly began. The consequences of that decision did not end in the 1940s. They still echo in how China views power, trust, and international agreements today. To understand modern China, we must return to that forgotten treaty, signed in 1945, and the hidden game that changed the course of history before anyone realized what was happening. What truly transformed China's post-war crisis into a decisive geopolitical moment was not ideology or popular support, but geography, and more specifically, Manchuria. As Japan collapsed in August 1945, the Soviet Union launched a massive and overwhelming offensive into northeastern China, destroying Japan's elite Kwantung Army in a matter of days. This was not a close contest or a prolonged campaign. Soviet tanks, artillery, and air power swept through the region with such force that resistance effectively collapsed. Within weeks, the Red Army controlled all of Manchuria, a territory that mattered more than any other part of China in the coming struggle. Manchuria was not just land. It was China's industrial heart, home to steel mills, coal mines, rail networks, power plants, and vast warehouses filled with Japanese military equipment. Whoever controlled Manchuria controlled heavy industry, logistics, and the ability to wage modern warfare. In the context of a renewed civil war, that advantage was decisive. At this moment, neither Mao Zedong nor Chiang Kai-shek had real authority over the region. Soviet forces occupied it entirely, and every road, rail line, factory, and weapons depot was effectively under Moscow's control. This meant that the future of China was no longer being shaped primarily by Chinese actors, but by a foreign power whose interests had little to do with China's internal political ideals. Stalin now held an extraordinary position of leverage. By choosing when to withdraw, how to withdraw, and what would be left behind, He could quietly determine the balance of power between the nationalists and the communists without ever firing a shot himself. If Manchuria were handed quickly and cleanly to Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists would likely overwhelm their opponents before the war could fully reignite. If access were delayed, manipulated, or selectively opened to communist forces, the outcome would shift dramatically. The Civil War had not officially resumed, but in strategic terms, it was already being decided. Manchuria was the prize that would define victory or defeat, and at this critical moment, China's destiny rested not on the battlefield, but on the calculations being made inside the Kremlin. With Manchuria firmly under Soviet control, the world's attention shifted to diplomacy, and on August 14, 1945, that diplomacy appeared to deliver a clear answer. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin signed what became known as the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance with the government of Chiang Kai-shek, a document that seemed to settle the question of China's future before the Civil War could resume. On paper, the treaty was unambiguous. The Soviet Union formally recognized Chiang's nationalist government as the sole legitimate authority in China. Stalin pledged to withdraw Soviet troops from Manchuria within 3 months and, most critically, promised not to provide any form of military, political, or logistical support to the Chinese Communist Party. In return, China accepted several concessions that were deeply unpopular domestically but strategically calculated, including recognition of Mongolian independence, Soviet access to key ports, and joint control over crucial rail infrastructure in the northeast. For Chiang Kai-shek, the treaty looked like a decisive geopolitical victory. With Stalin's neutrality guaranteed in writing, the communists appeared isolated and strategically doomed. In Washington and London, policymakers welcomed the agreement as a sign that post-war cooperation with Moscow might be possible and that China could stabilize under a Western-aligned government. To outside observers, the Civil War suddenly looked avoidable, perhaps even already resolved. But for Mao Zedong, the treaty landed like a shock. Years of rhetoric about international solidarity and revolutionary unity evaporated overnight. Mao sent urgent messages to Moscow seeking clarification, explanation, or reassurance, but none came. Stalin offered no public justification, no private apology, and no indication that anything beyond the written text mattered. The world took the treaty at face value, assuming that Stalin had chosen caution over ideology and stability over confrontation with the West. What few realized at the time was that the treaty was never designed to tell the whole story. It established a public narrative of cooperation while leaving ample room for maneuver behind the scenes. The signatures were real, the promises were documented, and the commitments were clear, yet the treaty's true function was not to end the conflict in China, but to create the conditions under which its outcome could be shaped quietly, indirectly, and without formal responsibility. What appeared to be a diplomatic conclusion was, in reality, the opening move of a much more complex and consequential game. While the treaty reassured diplomats and headlines around the world, events on the ground in Manchuria told a very different story, one that unfolded quietly and deliberately. As Soviet forces prepared their withdrawal, they did not leave behind a neutral landscape, but a carefully shaped one. The Red Army had seized the largest Japanese weapons stockpile in Asia, an arsenal vast enough to equip several modern armies, including hundreds of thousands of rifles, thousands of machine guns, artillery pieces, tanks, aircraft, and mountains of ammunition. Officially, these weapons were to be destroyed or secured before Soviet troops departed, and formally, Moscow maintained that it was honoring every clause of the treaty. In practice, the withdrawal became slow, fragmented, and selectively enforced. Soviet commanders cited damaged railways, administrative delays, and logistical difficulties, buying time while communist units began moving steadily into the region. These movements were not dramatic or openly coordinated. They happened in small numbers through rural routes and secondary towns, often unnoticed by outside observers. Soviet officers did not block them. In many cases, they facilitated their passage. When communist forces arrived, they encountered warehouses left unsecured, depots inexplicably unguarded, and rail yards filled with intact Japanese equipment. Weapons that should have been destroyed were simply left behind. In other cases, arms were transferred more directly, moved at night without documentation, leaving no official trace of Soviet involvement. If questioned, Moscow could point to the treaty and insist that no formal aid had been provided, and technically, that claim was true, yet the effect was unmistakable. The Chinese Communist forces were transformed almost overnight from a lightly armed guerrilla movement into a modern fighting force capable of conventional warfare. This was not accidental chaos or bureaucratic failure. It was a calculated strategy that allowed Joseph Stalin to shape the outcome of China's civil war without violating the letter of his agreement. With one hand, he signed a treaty pledging neutrality. With the other, he ensured that Mao Zedong received the tools necessary to win. The brilliance of the maneuver lay in its deniability. There were no public orders, no official transfers, no signatures tying Moscow directly to communist victory. Yet by the time Soviet troops finally completed their withdrawal, the strategic balance in Manchuria had already shifted beyond repair. What appeared from afar to be a clean diplomatic process was, in reality, the quiet execution of a double game that determined China's future before the wider world even understood what was at stake. By the time Chiang Kai-shek's forces were finally able to move into Manchuria in meaningful numbers, the war had already shifted beyond recovery, even though it had barely begun on paper. Nationalist commanders arrived expecting to secure factories, rail hubs, and depots promised under the treaty, only to discover a region that no longer resembled a neutral post-war landscape. Communist forces were already entrenched across key cities and transportation corridors, operating not as scattered guerrillas but as a disciplined, well-armed army prepared for sustained conventional combat. The industrial heartland Chiang had been counting on was effectively gone, absorbed into a new balance of power created during months of Soviet delay and silent transfer. The nationalists, burdened by long supply lines, corruption, and a population exhausted by years of war, now faced an opponent with superior positioning and rapidly improving firepower. Attempts to retake control were costly and slow, while communist forces, operating from secure bases, dictated the tempo of engagement. What followed over the next several years would be remembered as a civil war, but in strategic terms, its outcome had been decided earlier, in warehouses that were never locked and withdrawals that were never urgent. Stalin had completed his maneuver perfectly. He withdrew Soviet troops as promised, avoided open confrontation with the United States, and left no official evidence of interference, yet ensured that the Communists inherited the most valuable region in China. For Chiang Kai-shek, the realization came too late. Diplomatic guarantees had offered reassurance, but no protection, and by the time the scale of the shift became undeniable, there was no practical way to reverse it. Manchuria had become the foundation upon which communist victory would be built, providing the industry, logistics, and confidence necessary to defeat a government that still possessed international recognition but no longer controlled the decisive ground. The civil war would continue, battles would be fought, and millions more would suffer, but the central truth was now unavoidable. The most important contest had already been won in silence long before the world began paying attention, and China's future was moving toward an outcome shaped not by treaties or declarations, but by power exercised where no one was meant to see it. The shadow of 1945 did not fade with the end of the Civil War. It became embedded in how the new Chinese state understood the outside world. The lesson learned from Stalin's double game was not simply about betrayal, but about survival in a system where power, not principle, determines outcomes. From Beijing's perspective, international agreements are instruments to manage pressure and gain time, not guarantees of protection. This mindset can be seen decades later in China's participation in global institutions and treaties, where public commitments often coexist with parallel efforts to secure strategic independence. Whether in trade negotiations, climate pledges, or regional disputes, China has consistently approached cooperation with caution, assuming that promises will be honored only as long as they align with national interest. To Western audiences, this behavior is frequently framed as opportunistic or destabilizing. From China's historical viewpoint, it is defensive, shaped by a memory of vulnerability when written guarantees failed to prevent decisive loss. The leadership that emerged after 1949 internalized the belief that weakness invites manipulation and that trust without leverage is a liability rather than a virtue. This does not mean China rejects international order entirely, but that it engages with it on its own terms, always preparing for the possibility that rules will be ignored when circumstances change. The result is a persistent cycle of mutual suspicion. Western governments view China as a power that benefits from the system while bending its constraints, while China views the system itself as one historically designed to contain it. Both sides see their stance as justified by history. Both believe they are acting defensively. And at the center of this tension lies a moment rarely discussed outside academic circles, when a treaty signed in 1945 taught China that words on paper are never enough. That lesson continues to shape global politics long after the signatures themselves have faded from memory. The story of modern China is often told through ideology, revolution, and economic rise. But beneath those visible chapters lies a quieter origin that still shapes how the country moves through the world. In 1945, a treaty signed far from China's borders did more than influence a civil war. It taught an enduring lesson about power, trust, and survival in an unforgiving international system. What appeared to be a moment of diplomatic clarity became, in practice, a demonstration that written guarantees offer little protection when interests shift. For China, the consequences were not theoretical. Millions would die, a nation would be divided, and a new state would emerge, carrying with it a deep skepticism toward promises made by stronger powers. That skepticism did not disappear with time. It hardened into strategy, shaping how China approaches alliances, institutions, and agreements to this day. From Beijing's perspective, history proved that security cannot be outsourced and that reliance on external assurances invites vulnerability. For Western nations, this same behavior often appears as defiance of rules and norms that underpin global order. The tension between these views is not simply a clash of values, but a clash of historical memory. Both sides believe they are acting rationally, even defensively, based on what the past taught them. The Treaty of 1945 was forgotten by most of the world, but not by the state it helped create. Its legacy lives on in caution, in strategic ambiguity, and in the belief that power must always stand behind words. Understanding this does not require agreement, but it does demand recognition, because until the origins of that mistrust are acknowledged, the gap between China and the West will remain defined not only by competition, but by a history